State Bill 184, another new law in the state of Florida, whose written delineation will have nothing to do with the way law enforcement will actually implement this law. The bill's summary simply explains that you'll have to give 25 feet to law enforcement officers, paramedics, and firefighters who are engaging in an active scene, something you already would commonly do. And while the text definition is fairly straightforward, what is most concerning to the people in Florida is how this law will actually be implemented, since many of the law enforcement agencies in the state have a reputation for working outside of due process. Regardless, the state of Florida has become so overbearing and dominating with law enforcement that even if you were to capture law enforcement engaging in some type of misappropriation, the footage would prove inconsequential to law enforcement since they seem to do whatever they want regardless. But before we move any further, let's examine this law, its written context, and then we'll talk about its actual implementation. We're also going to examine how law enforcement in Florida responds to being recorded before the implementation of this law, as some of the practices that law enforcement currently has are somewhat concerning. SB 184, impeding, harassing, or threatening first responders, which by the way is already illegal in Florida. Requiring 25 feet distance to any first responder, and there's some interesting vocabulary in this law. The law clearly stipulates that you cannot cause emotional distress to these officers. Who knew people in law enforcement were so sensitive? My biggest question is, how do you define emotional distress? I think that's something that can vary from person to person, and some of these police officers may be extra delicate. So I can be arrested based on the emotional state of a police officer. Alright, so the inconclusiveness of this law's definition only raises questions about its actual implementation. But as we know in the state of Florida, the definitive answer is not exactly what the law states, but what its intended purpose is. And let's dive into that. I'm sure that's the reason you're watching today's video. Anyways, how could law enforcement implement this law in ways that are somewhat concerning to the people of Florida, since after all, the vast majority of people who are recording law enforcement are not doing it out of a malignant purpose or to interfere with law enforcement. I'm going to show you guys a few interactions that I've had with law enforcement in Florida that will simply highlight exactly why this law is concerning. And we're not going to be able to cover every possible scenario. For example, imagine a scenario that you and your wife are in a vehicle and one of you guys decides to record the interaction with the other person. Could you not then record law enforcement within your own vehicle? What if you're standing on your front lawn and a scene is taking place adjacent to your property? Is law enforcement going to tell you that you can't record on your own property? All that is inconclusive with this law. It isn't definitive, and it raises a lot of questions that most of us in Florida would probably not feel comfortable with. And practically, what's going to happen is that anytime you record law enforcement in the state of Florida, they're going to confiscate your footage and claim that it's going to be for evidence in determining whether you violated that law or not. And by the way, once they have access to your phone, they're going to search through it and try to see if you're engaging in other illicit activities. So just be prepared if you're recording law enforcement in the state of Florida with your cell phone, that they're going to confiscate it, and they're of course going to use it as evidence, which means they're going to look through your phone, they're going to look through your devices. So if you decide to record law enforcement in the state of Florida, be aware that they're going to come up to you and they're going to confiscate your device, claiming that it is now evidence for a criminal accusation against you if they believe you are within 25 feet. And of course, that's going to be up to their discretion. They're not going to have a ruler out there to measure. So, hey, if you want to try your luck, go ahead. This is the state of Florida. And of course, what's going to prevent law enforcement from deleting the footage once they confiscate it? It's absolutely the most indicative sign that law enforcement in Florida is looking to interfere with due process, something that has been a lot of concern to the people in Florida. This law will serve as another tool to disarm anyone making a concern to the state of Florida or a grievance of lack of due process. And would you like to know why this law now exists in the state of Florida? Let me tell you why. In my hometown, Naples, Florida, during the riots that we had a few years back, a person was in a van in Naples, Florida, on the intersection of Davis and US 41. He was driving back from work. A riot erupted around him. He wasn't part of the riot. He was on his way to work. Law enforcement arrested him for using his vehicle as a murder weapon against a police officer. This person would have gone down for 15 years for assaulting a police officer with a deadly weapon. Well, it turns out that on the outskirts of this scenario was a young lady who had a phone, and she actually recorded what really took place. After this footage came out, it became apparent that the police officer exaggerated what actually took place, and they had to drop the charges, release the young man. This individual would have gone to prison for upwards of 15 years for trying to hurt a police officer based solely on the police officer's accusation. When the evidence came forth, it was clear that he was just not even part of the riot. The riot formed around his vehicle and he was trapped inside the riot. He was not trying to hurt the police officer, but the police officer went ahead and put a charge on him that would have had him put away for almost, well, an unfortunately long amount of time. So the real reason why the state of Florida wants this law is because when there are riots and brawls, these officers get caught in the heat of the moment and they charge people with horrendous crimes, and many times it is inaccurate, and somebody will have video footage of how things actually took place that will contradict the charges that were placed on the individual, have to be dropped and dismissed. And it would be a tragedy if the state of Florida had to release an innocent person on a charge they didn't commit. Now, with this new law enforcement will simply be able to confiscate everybody's devices. What is to say if that footage has police misappropriation, or it doesn't match the narrative that they would like to paint? The law enforcement will not tamper with these devices to delete the footage that they don't want you to see. It could be police misconduct. It could be just not matching the narrative they want, or they just want to delete it for the sake of deleting it. If law enforcement engaging in inappropriate conduct has the ability to take your device, what is going to prevent them from deleting that footage that could be condemning to those police officers' behavior? The fact that everybody has a camera and a phone is the reason that police have had to step down their profiling of minorities like Hispanics and blacks in Florida, because now everybody has a phone to record police misconduct. If it wasn't for that particular technological advancement, we wouldn't be at the point where law enforcement is afraid to profile and harass individuals and violate their due process. We've even seen law enforcement now shift to harassing and taking away due process of homeless individuals because they're more vulnerable, less likely to have devices, less likely to be able to pay lawyers to get them out of hurdles like these. But if now, when law enforcement comes on a scene or a brawl like this, they're able to confiscate everybody's cameras, well, then they can paint the narrative however they want. They can delete footage they don't like. It sounds absolutely illogical that the person who you are contending with at law will have the ability to garnish your evidence and be able to tamper with it freely. The implementation of this law is a very concerning issue for the people of Florida who are afraid of having law enforcement strip away their due process. The intention of law enforcement and these courts in the state of Florida is to do whatever they want. They don't want to see your camera footage. They don't want to see evidence. And this doesn't just go for law enforcement. This goes for courts in general, even civil cases. They don't care to see footage. They don't care to see evidence. If we have evidence on black and white film, it makes the job of the courts and the lawyers annulled. These court systems do not want the implementation of modern technology because it is factual information that contradicts their process, the way they like to move. So here's these footages and videos that contradict the way they're doing things. Law enforcement agencies don't want to be in the wrong. They don't want a regular person like me and you to point a finger and say, hey, I have evidence that you did something wrong. It leads to lawsuits, and it leads to them having to dismiss cases that they don't want to dismiss, because law isn't based on you did this or you did that. It's the intention. It is to arrest the people that they want to arrest. It is to suppress the scenarios that they want to suppress. And anything that gets in the way of that is a problem. But with laws like this, they're able to continue doing whatever they want, the way they want, and nobody can impede in their lack of due process. The legal system in the United States does not want evidence. They want lawyers. They want to go with their antiquated legal system. The reason they like their antiquated legal system is because it gives them power. Evidence strips away power, and thus that is why we have laws like this that continue to prolong an antiquated legal system that is based on who is who, not what happened. What actually happened is irrelevant in a legal setting. They don't want evidence. They want, on paper, to do things the way they want, and that's really the problem. They want to continue this antiquated system with the legal processes because that gives them power. If all of a sudden people are able to find wrongdoing with law enforcement, find lacks of due process, or find technicalities that have to make them dismiss their cases, then that, in theory, gets in the way of their ultimate goal, which is the power of being able to do whatever they want. The antiquated court system is a consolidation of the power of the authorities, and anything that works against that has to be dismissed by them. Let's take a look at a recent encounter that I had with law enforcement. This is the arrest of a homeless person for trespassing in Bradenton, Florida by the Manatee County Sheriff's Office. The first thing I want to do is show you guys with the property appraiser website that we are 30 feet from the road where we are standing. We are roughly 45 feet from the crest of the road and about 70 feet from where the incident occurred. So in theory, where I was standing was a very safe distance to record that wasn't interfering with law enforcement. I wasn't in the same parcel. There's a ditch in the middle that's somewhat of a barrier, which would prevent me from being able to, be in the same area. But even though I'm about 70 feet from this scenario, let's take a look how this unfolded so you guys can understand the way law enforcement actually works in Florida. All this over a trespassing charge?
Yes, sir.
That's my cousin. That's my cousin.
They had him bad, bro. Huh? They screwed him up bad. Just say so, because if you give them a bad vibe, they're gonna come out at you. You know what I'm saying? Like they want to get somebody. I'm just working, ma'am.
I understand. We're allowed to record. I don't really care about that. Right. Can you guys just move so that he doesn't react so much?
I'm saying,
I'm just doing my job just like you are. I'm doing my job just like you are, ma'am. So I'm well over 40 feet away from where this is happening. There's a ditch in the middle. She came at me with handcuffs in her hand, telling me to leave. That should just give you an idea that these law enforcement officers in Florida, even before the implementation of this law, are trying to arrest you simply for recording this scenario. So imagine now, if this is the way they behave before this law, how do you think they're going to behave afterwards? When I'm more than twice the distance from that scenario and she came at me with handcuffs. So imagine after the implementation of this law, clearly they can already arrest you if they want to. So I'm a full-time YouTuber.
Tell you what happened. The only reason why we're arresting him today is because he's been trespassed already once from here.
Okay, he's trespassed.
Gave us a false name.
Okay, understood.
He trespassed less than a year ago, and he trespassed.
You gotta love how they're blasting Mexican music in front of the cops just to be arrogant.
Again, that's
I understand.
Arrested. It's a misdemeanor.
All right.
He gave us false name to ID. Okay.
Understood. I'm not one of these what do you call them? Civil rights.
I just had an incident with them already once.
I'm not a civil rights
What is his name,
YouTuber.
then?
You guys just left my house.
I'm not a civil rights YouTuber. I'm just a regular.
just
I'm
left-
I
just.
understand that, but what
You know,
is
like
his name? No. I'm asking what his name is.
Oh, y'all, them again.
They're arresting him for trespassing, but they don't know his name. Now, my purpose in recording this video is simply that I need footage of law enforcement engaging in work for my YouTube channel. So when I make a news story, I have realistic looking clips to make my video. So I didn't care if the person was innocent or guilty. I wasn't interfering with their work. All I was trying to do was just get my footage because I think it's cool footage of an arrest. So even when you are not engaging law enforcement, they engage you. And in this case, by her coming up to me, now the crime scene or the boundary is no longer 25 feet. Now she came up to me, which now puts me within that 25-foot boundary. And that's exactly what's going to happen to people who start to record in Florida. And let me just show you a video of that already happening, or a similar scenario that illustrates that law enforcement is going to approach you. They're going to park a police car next to you and tell you to move. They're going to, wherever you, so let me just show you some of the tactics that they use here in Florida to deter people from recording anything that has to do with law enforcement. So I'm going to show you guys now a few tactics that law enforcement uses with the purpose of deterring or interfering with people recording procedures that are all within the legality of due process. It's not like you're overreaching by doing this. This is just me doing my job, and law enforcement overreaches and tries to impede me from doing what I have to do. So even people like myself who are reporting respectfully without interfering, they want to implement the fear that you could get arrested or that you're doing something wrong even when you're not. Let me just show you guys some of their tactics. That if you make this type of request, you would receive it within a very reasonable time frame. We're gonna go ahead and leave since it looks like they're making noise on purpose. They are actually making noise with their vehicles to prevent us from getting our video in front of their office. So the reason we were at the Manatee County Sheriff's Office is because we're trying to obtain footage of a homeless person that was arrested in Manatee County, Florida, with the implementation of the new homeless law. Now that took first October 1st. It is now 12/28 and we still have not received the footage of this arrest. The Manatee County Sheriff's Office is telling us that there's a long wait list. We've been in there several times trying to nicely tell them that we need the footage, that they cannot continue to prolong this process. But of course, they're playing a long game. But when we were outside trying to record our video, you can see how they went ahead and made noises to disrupt our recording. So this should just give you an idea of the type of behaviors that these agencies like to take part in to obstruct people from just documenting when you're trying to request due process. So anytime that you're demanding due process from these agencies, this is the type of behavior that they engage in to try to persuade you not to request due process. So it's an interesting thing that somebody would get belligerent with you, not because of your behavior, simply because you're requesting due process. All right, so the last scenario that we're going to be reviewing is kind of blurred because there were many minors involved in this incident. This took place in the city of Tampa outside of a high school. There was some type of brawl outside of a school, and as you can see, there were hundreds of people involved and there were dozens of police officers engaging in this activity. Nobody here was recording anything. So there's hundreds of people involved in this street brawl, but nobody was recording the cops. Literally not a single person here had a camera other than myself and two adults that you're going to see up ahead on the right side of our screen. This is another scenario where I'm documenting what's happening for news purposes. I don't know any of these people that are involved. I don't have any sentiment for law enforcement or for the individuals involved. All I am doing is documenting the chaos that was taking place on the streets of Tampa. And again, the images are blurred because there are many minors involved. Now, law enforcement took a standoff position with two adults that were on the sidewalk because they were property owners and they were trying to get the individuals involved in the brawl and the law enforcement off their front lawn. So imagine now that you are on your property and this brawl takes place in front of your house. You have strangers and law enforcement on your front yard. In this case, you have the right to expel law enforcement, tell them to get off your property. I'm not part of this. I don't want to be part of this. You need to get off my property. But I'll show you guys from the original footage how law enforcement officers imposed themselves on this property owner who was trying to evict law enforcement off their property. So here's the gentleman in the gray shirt. It's his property. He tells law enforcement, you need to get off my property. He tells all these kids that they need to get off his property. You can see him telling everybody to leave, including law enforcement. Now, in this scenario, This property owner now on the grass, that's his property. So you can see the cops are walking into his property. He tells the law enforcement officers that they need to get off his property. So they're standing on his private property. So he tells the law enforcement officers that they need to back off. They need to get off his property. So he's telling them, get off my property line. You can see now how there's 10 police officers and he's standing on the perimeter of his property with his friend. And he's telling them, hey, you guys need to get off my property. So now you can see the law enforcement is hovering over the sidewalk. He's telling them, hey, you guys got to keep it moving. You need to get up off our property. So in this scenario, both of these individuals are recording law enforcement, but they are on their property. Under these new laws, law enforcement could technically, I guess, under this new law, could go on their property and take away their cameras. Law enforcement could, what are they going to do? Are they going to arrest him for recording on their own property? I mean, it really, in this particular scenario, right? This is the homeowner telling the cops they need to get off his property. In that scenario, under this law, what do? He's on his property. He has the right to record on his property. He has the right to tell law enforcement to get off his property, but they could confiscate those cell phones. And obviously, he was arguing with the cops, telling them, hey, I want to sue you if you don't get off my property. You don't have the right to be here. So under the new law, those police officers could have taken away both of their cell phones and even arrested or fined them for, interfering with a scenario, even though they were on their own property. So this new law is very inconclusive with determinations of property, distances, and how far law enforcement can go, because the moment that they determine that you're now violating that law, they can take your phone as evidence. In the case of those individuals that are standing on their property, defending their property from a street brawl and from the encroachment of law enforcement on their property without a warrant, would law enforcement be able to take away their devices? Would law enforcement be able to fine them for the 25-foot law? Because after all, law enforcement brought themselves to his property, okay? So, and they're setting up a perimeter hundreds of feet away from the actual scene. So if law enforcement sets up a perimeter like this here, where they set up a perimeter for hundreds of feet in all directions, that doesn't really leave a 25-foot boundary. It actually, in this scenario here, they blocked off several city blocks to handle this scenario. So in theory, anybody within that boundary would be considered violating that law, even if they're saying, well, what is the crime scene? So in theory, the scene, the scenario would be where the action's happening, but that's not the way it's going to work. I mean, these police officers can station a police car in front of your house 300 feet away and say, well, we're stationed here. You can't go in this buffer area. So it's very inconclusive. I mean, practically, if you're passing a police officer, how do you even know if they're engaging in an active activity or not? What if the police come to your property, like in the case of this individual where the cops came to his property? What if you are standing in front of your property and the police comes to you? Do you still have to respect that boundary if you're on your property? What if there's a duplex scenario where there's two properties and the situation is going on next door? Or an apartment complex where it's like everybody has joint ownership. If you're on in a condo association where everybody co-op owns everything together, can law enforcement tell you that you can't be outside of your apartment if they set up a perimeter? I mean, it doesn't really, it's very inconclusive. And in that inconclusiveness, it lends itself to a lot of misappropriation. And in the case of individuals like myself, I don't document these things for any purpose of impeding law enforcement. I'm not interfering with them. I don't know who these people are. All I'm doing is just documenting for news purposes a scenario, a brawl in the streets. But in the process of doing that, law enforcement approaches you, or law enforcement, like this cop came up behind me with a mace. I'm not going to him. I'm not part of, where is this crime scene here? What is the boundary? Like in this scene here, there's hundreds of people brawling and people walking and spectators and people outside their properties. What is the boundary? Where is the crime? Where is the definitions of, see, they parked their police cars on his front yard. That's his private property. He's got the right to tell them to leave. So it's his property. He's got the right to tell everybody to get off his property. So in this particular scenario, how is this law implemented or applied in this scenario? Definitively, Law enforcement doesn't know if he owns that property or not. What if it's a co-op? What if it's a condo association? Let's say one individual or two or three are causing a disruption. Like here, there's individuals who are causing a disruption, right? How do you exactly determine what that boundary is when the police officers are moving back and forth? When there's police cars, are police cars part of the incident? If they park police cars 100 feet away from the incident, is that police car a buffer itself? If they surround a neighborhood with police cars, is now that entire neighborhood within the boundaries of the area they don't want you recording it? It really is very, it's not definitive. And obviously, a YouTuber like myself wouldn't interfere with law enforcement, but here I parked my vehicle on the grass. Tampa PD came and boxed me in from behind. So that's my red vehicle there. So Tampa Police Department came in from behind me and boxed me into this scenario. So now I feel like if I'm on the road and I get boxed in by police officers in a street brawl, I should have the right to record and possess my recordings because I'm not part of whatever's going on. I'm my own person. So if I'm on a public road and a street brawl breaks out and law enforcement surrounds the scene, am I now in violation of this law simply for protecting my property, for recording myself? And in the case of that individual in Naples, they charged him for trying to run over a police officer in a scenario like this. A street brawl breaks out and they wanted to charge this person with literally send him away for 15 years. And if it wasn't for that one individual person who recorded it, that person would now be sitting for many years in prison. It was the footage from a bystander that saved this man many years in prison. And what's interesting here in this particular case is a street brawl with hundreds of people, and the only people who had cell phones out were the two property owners that were trying to get people off their property because they were defending their property, and me, a person reporting on a news story. So none of these people involved were trying to catch police doing something they weren't supposed to, or interfering with police by using cell phone devices or recording devices. I mean, in the case of this particular case, the only people who had phones out were the property owners who were concerned about the police cars on their property. Maybe they have septic tanks and, parking a car on top of the septic tank could break an underground pipe or something. So they have their legitimate reasons to get all this crap off their property. And I myself doing my news story. So here's 2-3 individuals with cameras who are not impeding law enforcement work in any type of illegitimate way, while the hundreds of people involved in this street brawl are doing something inappropriate. Not a single one of them had a camera. So when people pull out cameras and start to record the police, it isn't necessarily that the people recording are trying to impede law enforcement. It's people who possibly have some type of legitimate reason to be doing it. So the notion that people are recording law enforcement or all that, that doesn't even, when people are doing something they're not supposed to, they don't want to be on camera. Like these people here were screaming at me, threatening me for recording because they don't want to be on camera. They're doing something they're not supposed to. So at the end of the day, it's a very concerning law. And I do believe that this law has the potential to really strip people away from their rights, and for law enforcement to actually be the one to impede with due process, for law enforcement to be able to destroy evidence, or if there's any wrongdoing from law enforcement, they'll be able to confiscate people's cameras and delete that evidence. It doesn't really seem like a logical law, and I don't think people in the state of Florida are bothering law enforcement. You saw when I was recording that scenario how the cop came at me with handcuffs. They could have slapped me with any stupid charge of interfering with law enforcement already, simply for being there recording. So why this law? Well, the purpose of this law is to strip away people's rights so that they can continue to act with lack of due process. Hopefully you never find yourself in a situation where you have to pull out a camera and record law enforcement, but if you do, it may be a situation where you wouldn't want those same law enforcement officers to take away your camera and hold it as evidence. Obviously, the biggest concern that people have is that now law enforcement will be able to move back the line hundreds of feet. So whatever the brawl is, the scenario is, you're not going to be able to approach within 25 feet. Even before the implementation of this law, if you get within 50 or 100 feet of a camera, they come up to you and tell you they're going to arrest you. So with this new law, not only are they going to come up and tell you they're going to arrest you like they did to me, but they're also going to confiscate your device and say it's evidence. And even if it isn't, what's going to prevent them from confiscating your device? And if there is anything on that phone, what's going to prevent them from deleting it? So this is a very concerning law. Nobody is actually harassing law enforcement. Nobody is actually emotionally distressing law enforcement officers. For the most part, law enforcement officers, even when they're vastly outnumbered, the only thing people ask is that they behave in a civil manner. Like, that's not really, even like in wild, unhinged situations like this where hundreds of people are doing a street brawl, people are not exactly over imposing themselves on law enforcement officers. I mean, in the case of these individuals, they're on their property, and this scenario came to them. They didn't go to this scenario. If the same exact event had taken place after the implementation of this law, I'm pretty sure the law enforcement officers would have taken those two individuals' cameras, and then they would have walked all over his property and done whatever they wanted. In the case of me just recording what happened, law enforcement officers ignored me and I ignored them. But I'm pretty sure if I was recording this, they would have forced me, not for within 25 feet of the incident, but they would have forced me all the way back hundreds of feet away from the scenario. And if I tried to, be within 25 feet of the scenario, I would have got arrested. There's no doubt about it. There's no doubt that if a person is properly trying to respect this law, you're trying to stay 25 feet away from the action, there's no doubt that these law enforcement officers are going to infringe on that right. There's no doubt. Because already, without that law, we saw what that young police officer tried to do to me, telling me that I was interfering from 50 feet away with a camera, not saying a word, not being related to anything that was happening on the ground. So, yeah, it is concerning. It is very concerning that this law is taking place. But, again, you know what the intentions of law enforcement are in the state of Florida. The intentions are to oppress, to dominate. They want to turn Florida into Alabama, where law enforcement officers are almighty and sovereign. This is what the state of Florida wants to do. They want to have an Alabama type of law enforcement power, where law enforcement does whatever it wants and it's unquestionable. And frankly, that isn't what most people in the United States want. It may be what they want. It may be what people in Alabama want. But I really doubt that people in Florida want to live in a police state like Alabama, where if you're dealing with law enforcement, you have absolutely no rights, you have no power. They do whatever they want. I don't think people in Florida want to live in a good old boy system, but this is the way the laws in the state of Florida are unfolding, and it may be a reason for a lot of people to really reconsider whether they want to live in a state that is ever more imposing. And this law is not definitive. It means that if you are on a one-on-one basis dealing with a police officer, if you personally are the incident, then those officers will have the right to confiscate your camera. So let's say you're not alienated from an event. You are the event, right? Law enforcement is out there dealing with you as an individual. If law enforcement is dealing with you as an individual, you will not be permitted to record that incident. Do you understand that now you're dealing with a police officer who starts to disrespect you or starts to get violent or is acting irrational? And if you try to record that police officer, they will take your device from you. And of course, they're going to delete whatever it is if they're acting inappropriately. That is not exactly something most of us would want. Let's say right now you're just minding your own business, and for who knows what reason, a police officer pulls you over and gets violent, gets scary, gets threatening. They think you're the wrong person and they think you committed a crime you didn't do. And all you want to do is just record it because you're afraid. They will be able to take your phone from you, claim it's evidence in regarding to the violation of this law, and most likely they're going to delete whatever that footage is. Could you block your phone? I guess we're going to have to block our phones, and I guess if you're recording law enforcement, you may want to have another device that isn't your day-to-day cell phone, because it opens a realm of possibilities. Again, it's a very lacking definition law. It isn't definitive. It isn't exact. And this is going to create a lot of confusion. And where there's confusion, it creates opportunities for law enforcement to impede lack of due process, which is the real intent of this law, is to continue to impede lack of due process. Law enforcement just being able to go in there and do things the way they want, similar to what happens in states like Alabama, where when I lived in the state of Alabama, it wasn't even worth recording a police officer. Why would you even record a police officer in Alabama when you know that the courts are going to do whatever they want if you end up in a court? You're completely vulnerable. It's a scary feeling to deal with an individual that has that much power, authority, and has absolutely no accountability. It is terrifying. I have lived in Alabama, and I never liked that feeling of dealing with an individual who has infinite power, no accountability, and even if you were to devise some type of evidence against that individual, it has no validation because it's a good old boy system where they do whatever they want. That is not the type of place I want to live in. And again, as you've seen here, hundreds of people. When people are doing something they're not supposed to be doing with law enforcement, they do not want to be on camera. The people who pull out cameras in front of law enforcement are people that are demanding accountability, which is kind of one of the principles of law based in the United States. But anyways, there you go. That's today's story.